So I sat down to speak with Mark JENKIN over Skype about his new film Bait, which is coming out on August 30th. It's actually coming to Edinburgh a little bit before then. It's going to be at the Film House on the 27th with a Q&A from him. It's a very unique film, shot on 16mm without any sound. He dubs it in afterwards. He hand-developed the film. It premiered at Berlin, and it's a very interesting film, so I think he was a good director to speak to. So we'll go into the interview now, and I started off by just asking him to tell us a little bit more about the plot of the film and how he came to make the story. First of all, congratulations on the film. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I saw it back at the Edinburgh Film Festival.
Ah, brilliant. Thank you.
So I think just for folk who haven't seen it, because obviously we'll be broadcasting this just before it comes to the Edinburgh Film House, can you tell us just a little bit more about the film and the story of it to kind of set the scene for how you then approached it?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny talking about the story now and the themes that are involved in the film, because I've been out at festivals so much with it and doing a lot of Q&As and that kind of thing that I'm a bit lost as to what I think the film is about and what other people have told me they think it's about. So in some ways it's a film about fishing. In some ways it's a film about Cornish traditional cove fishing. In other ways it's about gentrification. It's about class. It's about alienation. And in the context of the moment, it seems to be more and more considered a film about what happens when people who don't feel they're listened to for whatever reason decide to kind of kick back. That seems to be the modern context. But when I came up with the idea 20 years ago, it was really at the height of the summer in Cornwall, where Cornwall was really busy with the bit of Cornwall that I was living in, North Cornwall. It was very busy with a very specific set of visitors who were quite young people, who were mostly private school educated, who came down en masse in their groups from their schools, and were really a stronger community than the local community that had become very fractured due to the decline of traditional industries. And then what actually happened was, over the years, you then got other groups from other schools who were coming down, and there sort of seemed to be this sort of antagonism between the school groups, and this ended up with huge fights and disturbances in North Cornwall, and this was kind of probably 15 years ago by the time I've been developing the film for 5 years. And I just got interested in where the sort of locals were in all of this, and so I decided I wanted to make a film about a fisherman, and it could have been about anything. It could have been about a farmer or any kind of traditional person working in a traditional industry. But I really wanted to make a film about the fishing community as well, because it's a community that I've always grown up around, and a community that I think has always been badly represented on screen and simplified. And there's stereotypes that have lived long regarding the fishing industry, when actually they're all nonsense. So I think it was a combination of all of those factors. And then during the 20 years that the project has been developed, and I haven't been working on it constantly for 20 years, but I've picked it up several times over the years. It's changed into something else, really. But the heart of it is still wanting to show the fishing community, but also just show that what happens when a community becomes alienated, disenfranchised, and that kind of thing. And I think to some extent the success of the film has been due to a bit of luck with regard to timing and what's going on in this country, but all over the world in terms of the gaps between the haves and the have-nots growing.
Yeah, there was something I wanted to ask you about, actually, because I've noticed that it's become, mainly because of something that it seems to have been inserted in the sound edit, quite a strong Brexit parallel with this. But I was wondering what your view was on this, because I have to be honest, I really liked the film, but that part, or at least it being as explicit as that, kind of slipped past me as I was watching the film. It felt a lot more rooted to me in the characters and so forth. So what do you make of well, first of all, you can maybe explain like how that's actually happened, but what were your feelings on that when that analysis kind of started to take off about the film?
It was a surprise. It was a huge surprise. What happened was that when we were just about to complete the film, and we were in the final stages of the sound mix, and there's scenes in the kitchen of this holiday home with the sort of lead incomer family, and there was a scene where there was dialogue between characters, but it was very fragmented, and I became very aware that there was a silence over the scene that made the scene much more ominous than it needed to be. So I thought we need a little bit of background noise in the kitchen. So I thought they'd probably be listening to the radio. They'd probably be listening to Radio 4. The radio would be on in the background all the time. So I thought we can just fix this in the mix. We can just go and record a little bit of Radio 4 style sound to go in the background. So Kate Byers, who's one of the producers of the film, is a voiceover artist and was an actor. So I just got her to write a little piece, a little Radio 4, not a news report, but a kind of current affairs thing. And she wrote it very quickly, went into the voiceover booth, and we just recorded it straight onto the soundtrack. And it was about Brexit, so it was a discussion between. It was actually Lynn Waite, who's the other producer on the film. She played the other character within this kind of current affairs report, and it's them discussing Brexit and what may or may not happen. And I thought nothing of it. I mean, can't even remember whether we discussed whether it would be about Brexit. I think it was just unsaid, because you know what it's like at the moment. I mean, we seem to be on a little bit of a hiatus from it at the moment, maybe because of the summer, but you switch on the radio or the TV and it's all been Brexit. So it's not something I even really hear anymore. It's just white noise in the background, and that's what I really wanted it to be in that scene. So that was recorded, it was dropped in. I didn't really think anything of it. I mean, I did slide it slightly on the timeline so that a shot of some fresh fish being handed over in the visuals then married up with the sound of them talking about imported chlorine-washed chicken from the USA. Because I just thought, that was, there's a nice little bit of juxtaposition. But it was never meant to be a statement on Brexit one way or another. And I didn't think anybody would notice it. But what then happened was we went to Berlin for the world premiere, and the German subtitlers, because, as I say, this was quite a fractured scene with quite a lot of silence where the characters weren't talking, in that silence was this radio report, and the German subtitlers subtitled the radio report. So suddenly this Brexit stuff that was being spoken in the background that I didn't even really notice was suddenly at the foreground. So one of the first questions in the Q&A at the world premiere was a question about Brexit. So I thought, right, this is, it's a tricky enough topic. It's a really tricky topic. If you're from a fishing community, tensions run incredibly high about it. And so I thought, oh my God, here I am going to be the unofficial spokesperson for Brexit at Berlin. But it wasn't, it was never meant to be foreground. It was always meant to be background. But it was interesting because then people did start to read in, is the whole film an allegory for Brexit? And if they see it as that, then of course it is. But it was never my intention for it to be that. And I think you saying that it maybe passed you by is probably because I think the English-speaking audiences and the non-subtitled screenings, I think it does operate as a background noise, and it's the subtitles that bring it to the foreground. So also, I think having travelled around Europe with the film, I think people in Europe, my experience, are keener to talk about Brexit than we are, really. So I think it's more, they want to know what's going on. So as soon as there's a little signifier in there about Brexit, that people seem to hook onto that. Whereas I think, certainly from my point of view, I recoil from it if I see signifiers about Brexit, because it's all a bit too grim at the moment.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the technical approach you've taken as well, because obviously that's quite a striking thing about the film.
Yeah.
One thing I was wondering about is quite a lot of filmmakers speak about how creativity comes out of restriction, effectively. You can have people with enormous budgets and it feels like they can do anything, but it's almost like they're paralysed by choice. Is that something that you were consciously look for in the approach that you've taken with the hand-developed film, no sound is shot on location and things like that? Is it looking for a restriction which makes you think creatively about how you can capture the story you want within that.
Yes, exactly. It's about realising that I can't compete in terms of resources and budget. So it's not a level playing field. You know, we can't, if you're working on a low budget, you cannot compete with multi-million pound films with huge crews and huge resources. So in one way you think, you know, that the odds are stacked against us. But where the player field is absolutely level is in terms of access to your own creativity, or, you know, your own creativity. Everybody's got that in one way or another. What the limitations allow you to do is just to force to think creatively straight away. So we're getting ready to shoot another film in the spring, and it's getting to the point where I've redrafted the script several times. Now I need to lock down locations, and I won't be able to get the locations that I'm imagining in my head because they're imaginary. They don't actually exist. So I need those locations. That the film's going to be set on an island. We're not going to film it on an island, and it's mostly set around a cottage on an island. We need to find that cottage. At the moment, the idea in my head is that it's a cottage that's on an island, and I've got 360-degree shooting. Straight away, it's not going to be on an island, because like I say, we're not going to shoot it on an island. Secondly, we're not going to be able to shoot 360 degrees because there'll be something in the background that gives it away that it's not the right location. So suddenly I'll go, right, okay, I've got a 90-degree angle to shoot this with. I've got a very small angle that I can shoot this with. So then I rewrite the script based on just using the front of the house, for example. What then happens is that when the film's done, what's happened with Bait is this kind of like the formalism that a lot of people have commented on. And the rigour, that isn't set out beforehand. That's dictated to me through schedule, budget, locations, and that completely informs the way that the film looks. And then I kind of embrace that, and then that becomes the film, because then the film exists as an object, and you know, and then it's as if it was always meant to be that way, but it isn't. I think it's very disempowering to have complete freedom, complete artistic freedom, because you are kind of blinded by choices, and you never do anything because you're always thinking, well, there's a better thing that could come along. But if you're told, or you tell yourself this is all you've got, then you just get on with it. And you know, working under restrictions is the sort of sad truth that you look at great cinema. It's always important to look at what restrictions it was made under. You know, if you look, I mean, I just listened to a podcast about Tarkovsky's Stalker the other day, and just thinking about somebody like Tarkovsky, the restrictions that they would have to work under, creative, artistic, logistic, and the amazing art that comes out of that. So yeah, the restrictions are hugely important. And in fact, on Bait, we lost some money not that long before we were going to shoot the film, and the producers and myself had a conversation, and we've realised we had to lose something from the script because we couldn't afford to shoot everything that was on the page, having lost this chunk of money. And originally, the two brothers in the film were at war, but they both had fishing boats, and the younger brother had a smaller boat than the older brother.
Okay.
But a lot of the confrontation between the two brothers happened at sea between two boats, and so the obvious thing to lose when we lost some of the budget was to cut one of the boats. So we cut the younger brother's boat, which meant that then there had to be a rewrite, and the rewrite I came up with was that he would instead he was shooting a net off the beach. Now that was, I wouldn't have thought of that, but I had to think creatively, and that becomes really for me and for a lot of the response I've had to the film, that becomes such an iconic piece of action and piece of work. This sort of desperate guy who's a fisherman that hasn't got a boat. I wouldn't have written that in the script unless I'd been forced to come up with a solution to that boat issue.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because it really does add quite a very striking contrast to the situations. You know, he's still going in there with his hands and trying to get it done.
Yeah.
While there's, you know, these tourists and holidaymakers basically, you know, gallivanting around on what would have been his boat.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, you know, you then the fact that the Hugo character, the holidaymaker guy who goes spearfishing, he's then on the Martin, the younger brother fisherman, is then on a parallel with this leisure hobby holidaymaker fisherman who's actually got better gear than he's got. So then all of this other sort of subtext and juxtaposition comes out of it, which again I would never have written in the script because I'm not that good a writer.
The one other thing I want to ask you about in terms of the story is just whether it was informed by your own experiences of how certain communities are portrayed on screen. Because something I found quite interesting was, like, we follow Edward Rowe as Martin, and everybody we're following, they're locals. It's a reasonably sort of rural, in the sense of being seaside community.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about it was that we are following the people of that community. It's not being used as an awakening, if you like, for some sort of privileged urbanite, which is something that happens quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that played into how you came up with the story and what the focus of it actually was.
Yeah, completely. I wanted to redress the balance a little bit. Cornwall, and I talk about Cornwall because it's where I'm living and working and where I'm from and the place I understand, and I'm sure it's similar in other regions all over the world, but Cornwall's used as a background, a backdrop for other people's stories all over, all the time. And like you say, I like that you said awakening story. It's exactly it, isn't it? It's normally somebody from the city who kind of thinks they're happy, ends up in a rural environment through some sort of misadventure normally, and then but through an interaction with the simple indigenous folk, they learn a life lesson which then they can take back to their other life. And you know, and there's no, I mean, I hate the expressions character arcs, but the locals they never have any sort of narrative journey. They're just background. They're just devices to help the more sophisticated character refine their existence.
Yeah, it's a almost like kind of a strange, slightly banal form of like exoticism.
It is, and you know, that character, you know, the character never really. The character who comes into that community sort of takes the good stuff and goes away. You know, like community spirit or collectivism or whatever it is that they learn in a rural environment. But you know, they don't have to. They don't then stay and sort of, you know, live through the winter or the poverty or anything like that. So it's all a bit sickening, really. So it was about redressing that and actually showing that the people who live in a place like Cornwall, whether they're Cornish or not, you know, that what they do to get along and how people live, and you know, the good side of it and the bad side of it, and you know, just to bring that texture to the foreground rather than it being a background, because it is very rare that people do that, and there are exceptions. I mean, I would say that a film like Local Hero is kind of a film that really does nail that, mostly because of the ending. And that seems to be, you know, that final shot where there is I always think that's a little bit of a reference to the films where everything is fine once the protagonist goes back to their urban life, you know. But and something like Local Hero, which is so sophisticated and so dripping with humanity for all the characters, it really nails that. But that's a very rare example of this type of film working.
It's funny you say that, actually. Local Hero is probably one of my personal favourites, but that is one of the things that I quite like about it. It has this, you know, if you strip the story down to its bare bones, it's quite archetypal in that manner, but the manner in which it's handled is just so much more empathetic and intelligent than I think you often find, and I find that in Bait, obviously from a different focus perhaps. But that was definitely there.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, with Local Hero, first time I saw it, I just didn't get it at all. I'd heard so much about it, and I watched it, and then at the end, I was like, I don't get it. Who am I supposed to? Whose side am I on? And then it stays with you. And then I was thinking, that's the point, isn't it? You can kind of empathise with everybody and nobody, and And that's life, really, isn't it? It's not as simple as it is in the movie. So if that, although I'm not interested in realism or naturalism, I think that kind of empathy for people who maybe you haven't got a lot in common with is really interesting in cinema.
So you were here in Edinburgh for the Edinburgh Film Festival, and you're coming back on the 27th of July, I believe it is?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah. What I was wondering was, are you hoping, because there is a lot about tourists coming into a community, kind of changing the character of it, maybe short term, and the impact that has on people's lives. It's actually a discussion which is happening in Edinburgh quite strongly. I was wondering, are you hoping that there's maybe a bit of resonance with the local audience on that level? Because I don't know if it would have come up during the film festival, but certainly when you come back with it this month, it's going to be immediately after the Fringe Festival and the international festivals has finished. I was wondering if you'd thought about that at all.
I've thought about it a little bit, and I mean, I've thought about it in reference to Cornwall more in terms of when the film's being released. So, I mean, because today's the 16th of August, we've got our first Cornish preview tonight, and then I've got sort of 5 dates in Cornwall, and then the film's out on the 30th of August. And I wonder whether by the end of August the film's going to be riding this kind of populist wave of of sort of end of the summer, bring on September and the quiet months sort of sentiment within Cornwall. So yeah, maybe it'll be the same in Edinburgh. It's 27th of August, so it's kind of just as the festival's finished. So who can tell? What I have learned is that it's not a film. Bait isn't a film about Cornish fishermen and holidaymakers who visit Cornwall. It's something that's much more universal than that. And I think probably that's what I was hoping it was. But having gone out around the world with it, everywhere I go, there's communities that feel that they haven't got a stake in their own future. And I mean, when we were in New York with the North American premiere at the Walter Reed at Lincoln Center, and this woman came up to me at the end of the film and said, she said, "Thank you, you've made a film about my dad, and he was a fisherman all of his life in Barbados." And it was, the similar story. And I think I never realised that maybe the film was as universal as it appears to be, because I think the sad truth is there is probably a lack of discussion about the way communities are being and cities and rural areas and whatever are being changed. Who's making these decisions to change places in a specific way, and who are the people who are losing out in that, and who are the people who haven't got a voice. So yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see. There's some dates on the preview tour that I'm doing that I'm thinking maybe, is that going to resonate there? Is that, and normally places that I'm normally quite surprised in those places that there is some kind of similarity with what's going on in a Cornish fishing village and in the centre of what appears to be quite an affluent urban area. So maybe that will be the same for Edinburgh. I mean, also the thing with, I'm quite interested in the Scottish independence issue as well as I am with the Catalans. So whether what people kind of read into that with regard to the Cornish issue as well, and how well known that is, although it's not addressed in the film, it's kind of, I think it's there subtextually. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what a sort of local Edinburgh audience make of it, rather than a largely visiting festival audience.
You're clearly a filmmaker who's very invested in the process of making the film and what that can bring to the storytelling and how it harmonises with the look of the film to actually really kind of heighten the impact of it. And there's a lot of films now where there's limited screenings of it, and they tend to be quite big films. I mean, in terms of stuff that's coming out at a similar time to this, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is getting 35mm screenings. There's films in recent years where they get limited runs on 70mm, which is happening less and less. I suppose I'm really just looking for what your views are on those sort of screenings. Do you see that as a preservation of a way way of creating a story, or do you think that maybe it's being approached in a slightly gimmicky fashion in some cases, or if it's maybe a bit of both, depending on the filmmaker?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it is. I mean, as far as what I'm doing with Bait and how we're exhibiting it, which is sometimes digitally and sometimes the 35mm print, I think it's difficult to say because that would be more to do with the perception of from other people. But the way I look at it is, that at the moment, anything to get people into theatres, I think, is to be encouraged. I think it seems like the cinematic experience in some ways is becoming more in line with like a theatre experience, where you pay a premium and you go for a meal at the cinema, and and it becomes a real evening out rather than it being a normal kind of a more sort of populist art form. And I suppose with my film, I was always thinking that would be the area that we would be in, the very art house circuit I thought we'd be in. But I think for whatever reason, and I don't know, maybe it's just down to making a good film, maybe it's to do with the story, maybe who can tell? I wouldn't like to say, but there seems to be a little bit of crossover that we're enjoying, where we may well just be in some cinemas where it's just the film and it's projected digitally and the ticket price isn't extortionately expensive and all of that kind of stuff. So I suppose from looking at it in the sort of eye of the storm that I'm in at the moment, anything to get people into theatres, get people away from, not away from home streaming and all that, because that's all great, but just getting people to experience that theatrical experience. And I think
to continue, it's something worth continuing and preserving and getting people in to see.
Yeah. And I mean, my partner's boy, who's 11, he watches movies, and he watches a huge amount of movies, and he watches them at home, and he watches them in the cinema. And I think he knows that there's a huge difference between going and watching something in a theatre and watching something at home. And I think that gives me a lot of hope for the future of the form, whether he's in a huge minority, but he doesn't seem to be by the amount of kids who still go to cinema screenings. So I'm not massively precious about how films are seen, because how my films are seen, because I make films in an analog world, and I like the craft element of it. I consider myself a working person who's come from a working background, so physically making a film is really important for me, not as a statement particularly, but just because that's the type of person I am. So stood up, using my hands, using photochemical processes, using a manual camera, shooting it myself, cutting it myself, all of that kind of stuff. That's really important for me. Whether that's imbued within the final work, that's for others to say. But I don't make the work in the way that I make it as a statement. I just make it because that's what excites me when I go to bed on a Sunday night. It's the thought of working on film like that makes me excited to get up on Monday morning. So I'm not really thinking about anything other than my own enjoyment at that point. But I do understand that the large proportion of my audience are in a digital world. So although I make the films in an analog way, I'm quite happy for them to go into a digital world and be consumed in whatever way an audience wants to consume them. Obviously, sitting as we did the other day in NFT1 at the BFI in London and watching a 35mm print in a 500-seat auditorium, that's obviously a high point, but I don't, I'm not expecting that to happen in every single town and city in the country. But like I say, maybe my aspiration for the film was to get on a handful of screens. It seems to be we're going beyond that. So to think that it would be screening on a DCP in lots of screens, I'd be very happy with that.
The fact of the matter is, if you want to get films out to people and have people making films as well, then I don't think cinema has the luxury of being precious about it.
No, absolutely, and I think, and you can't have it two ways, really. I mean, I'm in a position, I'd say I'm in a privileged position, but I've kind of, I don't know how privileged it is, really, because I still work on tiny budgets, but I am in a position where I shoot on film. But like I say, the digital distribution has been incredible. We've got a cinema in Newlyn, which is the fishing village I live just up the hill from. We've got a 2-screen digital cinema. Now that wouldn't exist if digital distribution didn't exist, and I'd quite happily watch something that's been shot on film and projected by DCP. You know, I'm not, you know, not the kind of cheaper the running costs of these cinemas, hopefully the lower the ticket prices are going to be, and the more accessible cinema is to the masses, which is, you know, it was the art form of the masses, and I think it still is. It's just maybe the theatrical experience isn't for the masses anymore. But I've been reading about cinemas and the cinemas that I'm going to on this tour who've got a slight enhancement on ticket prices in order to offer lower ticket prices for other people. And I just think things just getting people in and just making it cheap and affordable. You know, we got a screening up in Newquay on Monday night, and it's £5. All the tickets are £5 to get in. And I just think things like that are so great in terms of getting the younger generations into the habit of going to the cinema, and a habit based on the exhilaration of watching something on a huge screen communally. And I think, you know, with the Tarantino sort of 70mm roadshow stuff, I think that's great, but it is almost like it's a marketing thing, isn't it? You know, the tour, the circus comes through town, and I know when the Hateful Eight went to Leicester Square, and then in Glasgow was the print that was in London, and I said, what, it's the same print? He said, yeah, of course it is. It's a 70mm print. There's only one in Europe, so that can't be a form of distribution. If you've got one print, because by the time it goes around all the cinemas, you know, films can be 30 years old by the time every cinema's had it. But in terms of getting that publicity up and charging a premium price, and you get the booklet and all of this kind of stuff, and the people who can afford to do it or who can't afford to do it but are determined to do it because they're cineasts or huge fans or whatever, I think that's great, because that helps the word of mouth, and it does single cinema out as an art form that's very idiosyncratic, which I think is one of its selling points. It doesn't necessarily mean you then have to go and see it on 70mm. But I mean, when Dunkirk came to Cornwall, I didn't go to the local cinema. I drove an hour to go to another cinema to see a 35mm print in a screening that was sold out.
I did a similar thing myself when I was living in Cambridge when Paul Thomas Anderson's The Master came out.
Oh yeah.
And it was like, you know, it's like a 40-minute train ride to London or something. So I popped on it and went to the Odeon Leicester Square. It seems a bit overkill looking back, but I'm glad I did.
Yeah, but you're talking about it now, aren't you? I mean, if you'd gone, would this even be a story if you'd gone and to your local cinema and seen the DCP of it? And I think that's the thing, is that, you know, life is about experience, and and sometimes, you know, travelling to do something or going that extra mile makes the whole experience very distinct. And I think that's and going to the cinema has always been a special experience, I think. You know, we've got a preview screening up in town in North Cornwall called Wadebridge on Sunday, and that's where I grew up. That's the cinema that I went to every weekend when I was growing up. It was like a second front room sort of thing, me and friends, and I still remember all the films I saw, you know, and so it's kind of emblazoned into my memory. So I think the more we can preserve that, not for the sake of nostalgia, but for just the sake of that it's an amazing experience even now, then whatever way we can do that, I think we should be doing it.